Hello and welcome to Groovecast, the podcast for the rhythm section with me, Ashley Walker.
And me, Charlie Smith.
And for today's episode, which is going to be our final episode of Season 2, we thought we'd do one of our favourite things, which is not talking about ourselves, talking about some other people.
Yeah, we've had enough of that this season.
Yeah. And so we've done a few sort of top 10 lists, top 5 lists, favourite groove albums, all that kind of thing. And so we thought we'd talk a little bit about some of our sort of, some more of our heroes and try and sort of narrow it down to my top 3 bass players and Charlie's top 3 drummers.
Yeah, it's just another attempt of how many ways can we get a top something into an episode of Groovecast format idea.
Yeah. And yeah, as like with all these things, it could have been like a million different people, as we've literally just been talking about before we started recording. And so if we get a chance, we'll give some honourable mentions, and in future we might even come back to this and do, another 3 picks. And unlike some of the other ones, as we've just been saying, and is there's no real order. It's not like there's going to be a top 1 or anything. It's just sort of 3 of our picks, really.
Yeah, 3 favourites.
Yeah, so do you want to start us off with one of your drummers that you've gone for?
Yeah, I mean, we said we tried to avoid some of the blindingly obvious choices that we've talked about at length before, but I'm going to do it and say Steve Gadd. Which, yes, we've spoke about it before, yes, we've discussed it, but you can't deny that he's, I would argue, the best session player alive at the minute. I mean, for me, what I've always liked about him is just his approach to playing. Is that it's all about the song. It's all about the feel and the groove. It's not about the flashy fill that he learnt last week or the licks and the chops and things. Although everyone tries to take off Steve Gadd licks, as I'm sure they do with certain bass players who we might come to. I know one in particular that you may discuss has exactly that same thing of, everyone wants to try and play a Steve Gadd lick or a whoever lick. But it's not about that. It's about he picked those to fit a particular song at a particular time. So yeah, for sort of that approach of his, of just, listen to any of the stuff he did with Al Jarreau or Chick Corea, even when he's on his, shall we say, the busier side of his playing, he's still totally about the groove and about doing everything to make the groove the best it can be. And I was watching an interview with him, I think with Rick Beato recently, that just came out. That was quite enjoyable to watch. For an hour of just Gadd stories and great stuff. I really enjoyed it. But he was talking about when he was in the band Stuff, which he did I think it was in the 70s, late 70s, with loads and loads of great players. Richard T was in the band on piano and a few others. And he said he was always looking at their faces during songs to see if they were if they were in the groove and see where the groove was at. He said he was looking at faces and as well as how they were playing. He was totally trying to find where the groove sort of sat for everyone, which I thought was kind of just a different approach to most people who would, just sit flailing away behind the kit, not giving a toss about what anyone else was doing. And so that kind of thing always has been something I've really liked. And then also just his should we say, musical choices sort of glean well with, for me, that he comes from, I think he comes from a rudimentary or military snare background, and so everything he does stems from that. Anything you hear, like the 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover thing, is all really, it's based around a rudiment pattern. Or the solos at the end of Asia are all based around, I'm going to talk French for a minute for you, but based around Ratner-McHughes and different flam patterns and ways of applying rudiments to the kit, which is kind of something I enjoy doing in my own playing, is putting rudiments around the kit in different ways rather than just flailing about 30-second notes looking for the next gospel chops or anything like that.
Yeah, what I like about Gad, I mean, he's one of these, certainly with two of my picks and probably with all three of yours, they're always like the ones that I talked about, like they're always going to be near the top of the list. And like, I know a lot of drummers who, like always go to him as their top one. And for me, what I like about him is he's done all the like Chick Corea and all that kind of, and the Steely Dan stuff, and then you can see him playing with like Eric Clapton or Paul Simon or stuff that's probably not for him like the hardest stuff to play, but as you say, suits the song. And when you see those like a few years ago, I think on Sky they had one of the Eric Clapton slow hand at 70 things on the TV, and it's like as soon as it comes on, you see him on drums. It's like, oh, this is going to be good.
Yeah, it is. It's that thing, and again, he's not only been a sideman, as some do. He's done his own stuff as well and had his own project on the go with like the Gad Gang or the Steve Gadd Band, and also doing stuff with. I saw him with an organ trio a couple of years ago with Michael Bleacher and Dan Hemmer. That was particularly brilliant. Like a really stripped back Hammond, sax, drums trio. Nothing in the way. No real dressing it up. Just that really raw and really pure, which I really liked. So yeah, but it's also, as you say, the variation. He's done jazz. He's done the funk stuff. He's done a bit of rock. He's worked with just about everyone there is to work with. I think he even played on some stuff with Paul McCartney when he was doing one of his solo albums, or I can't remember. I think it was one of his solo albums rather than a Wings project. But he played on stuff for him. I don't think there's many people who he hasn't worked with. Worth mentioning anyway. But that was. It's like just someone who can sort of crisscross the genres and work with anyone and still sound. It's one of those things as well. It's like he's got such a recognisable sound. Of the kind of the really flat dead toms. But obviously with his touch and things, it just makes it come alive.
Yeah, really. And like I know you've obviously been able to meet him and stuff, but one of the like really down to earth, and even that he's one of the like superstar drummers in terms of even people who aren't like into drums or into music like know of him and stuff, and a really cool guy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So swinging it over, let's hear your first pick.
Well, yeah, as you mentioned at the start of your one there, it's like tough to do one of these lists because, as we say, there's always like ones who are going to be near the top of the list, and we've probably talked about him quite a bit. I think this guy I haven't talked about that much on the podcast, probably because although he's one of like always near the top of the list, and even to this day still being talked about, he's not one who's as much influenced my playing, probably because it's just like of another world. But my one of mine was Jaco Pastorius, of course, and one of the things which is really funny because I was talking about him the other day with my bass teacher Paul. Shout out to Paul. He'll probably be watching or listening. It's one of these things where he's obviously been passed away for around nearly 40 years or something like that, and he's still being talked about to this day as being one of the greatest ever, if not the greatest ever. And it's one of those things where the more people talk about it, the more other people are kind of like, was he that great really? I mean, was he all that? And I think so. And just doing the research on him for this video, and then also talking to my bass teacher, it's like the stuff he's done that I never even realised. Like he played on a Joni Mitchell album and worked with Pat Metheny. And when I think some people, when you think of him initially, you think of maybe like the harmonics and crazy stuff he could do with his bass, and maybe really fast fingering or stuff like that. But then you listen to some of the stuff he played on the Joni Mitchell album, and also with Weather Report, some like really beautiful ballads. He just can sit in and groove, and even though he was probably like in the stars in his head or whatever, just away with the fairies. Yeah, and I mean, like when you look up like someone like him, just the amount of bass players he influenced and stuff, and then also doing the research, was learning about the band he put together, the Word of Mouth band, and just some of the names of the guys that were in his band just kind of says all you need to know, really. Like having Wayne Shorter, Michael Brecker, Pete Erskine on drums. Like I think you might have. I think Pete Erskine and Jacko were near the top of my list when we did the bass players and drummers list. I mean, Pete Erskine's probably got to be one of the most patient guys in the world. To like, he could sit in the groove while Jacko's just going crazy for like 10 minutes on the chicken or something.
Yeah, Peter Erskine's an incredible player, and of course Weather Report alumni, shall we say?
Yeah,
he did that for a long while. But yeah, he's a great jazz player as well, Peter Erskine. Really, just like small group stuff is some of the stuff he's done there is really, really nice.
Yeah,
I totally agree on Jacko. It's it's one of those people who I haven't listened to actively, though I've heard a lot of the stuff he's played on. Obviously I've played the chicken a thousand times with different bands over the years, but some of the Weather Report stuff, and some of the, as you say, like the Joni Mitchell thing, there's some really great tunes on there of a completely different style to what he was sort of known for.
Yeah, and one of the things that I did know before, kind of forgot about, was he was also a really good drummer as well. Not many people like think of that when they think of him, and I think also doing my research for this, I learned that he injured his wrist when he was young, and which affected his ability to play the drums. But I'm pretty sure on Teen Town he played the drums on that, and obviously Wayne Shorter's on that as well. But that's one of the like go-to things. Donna Lee as well is one of the things that you think about. But I think one of the reasons why he's like, one of the reasons I didn't want to pick him was because he is always like near the top of the list, and it's because like when he came on the scene, and I just know, again, talking to my bass teacher, how like it was just like crazy when they first heard the first solo album he ever did, and listening to like Come On Over, and he just totally like moved the goalposts as far as bass was concerned, and I think brought kind of the fretless thing a bit more to the forefront. I'm not sure if it's true or not, you'll have to do your own research into this, but I heard that originally his bass wasn't a fretless bass, it was just a Fender, like a Fender Precision or a Fender Jazz bass, and he took the frets off of it and made it what it was. But yeah, he's always one of those guys, when talking to bass players, he's always like there or thereabouts at the top of the list, so got to give a shout out to Jacko in this top three.
Yeah. But yeah, as you say, just one of those great players who's, just was something that, came around that was completely different, and, like no one had heard any of it before. As I'm sure, to be honest, I'm sure a few of the picks on our respective lists have been a bit of that kind of, you want to say game changer, but that kind of just came in and completely did something different, or did something at a different level, which is kind of brings us on to my next pick, which is another session great, and another one with again a very varied career, which is Simon Phillips. And yeah, with Simon, it's if you think about like what Gad does, Simon Phillips is a totally different approach to that. He's got the big kit and loads of sounds, loads of cymbals, and all the thing. but he knows how to use it. He's not using everything all the time, but when he does if he takes a solo as he does with his fusion band Protocol, or when he was doing the Toto gigs, he did a solo. I think it was during Hydra, but I could be wrong. He just has a really great approach as a soloist. In terms of being really melodic and sort of fluid in his playing style, which is something I'd really love to be more of. But life's too short for carting a drum kit that big about when you've not got a roadie. But yeah, and also his open-handed thing, which I think he sort of took that idea off of Billy Cobham a little bit. I think Billy Cobham was doing it just a bit before, but using that to his advantage of having the left hand on the hi-hat and having the right hand sort of free to do anything else, just makes for some really, really interesting ideas and patterns, which you just listen to them and you go, yeah, that's kind of something really different and something you don't hear many other players doing. So, and looking through his sort of his CV, you've got people as wide as Toto and his jazz things with Hiromi and Protocol, his fusion band, but then he's also worked with The Who. He worked on Jesus Christ Superstar in the West End. He worked with Judas Priest, which is a vast world away from, and then also, of course, playing in the Sid Phillips orchestra, which was his dad's dance band when he was a kid. That was his first gig. So it was like going from dance band to Judas Priest is quite the jump. But yeah, and sort of on the thing of Gad, there is an album we may have mentioned before on here, which is Windows in the Jungle by 10cc, and it's got both of them on it. It's got Steve Gadd and Simon Phillips on it, that's about as good as it could get for me as far as drummers on an album.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it before, but I think like that. I mean, obviously he was in Toto for a few years, and I loved the lineup with him. Obviously, when Lee Sklar came in and depped on it, but my favourite, probably one of my favourite Toto live concerts, is the one with Nathan East and Simon Phillips, and just like it's just such a great concert. And yeah, again, he's one of these guys who like Gad can just do what like you just said there about his playing style, but then he can just sit totally in the style of the song. And I think as well, as I know we've talked about before with Toto, especially like with Jeff Porcaro, they already had such a great drummer, and like so people loved his style. And he came when Simon Phillips came, and it wasn't like he was trying to be Jeff Porcaro. He like took it and did his own thing with it, didn't he? And I loved it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's got to be said, Jeff Porcaro was really high on my list of potentials for this episode, but as you'll hear, slightly didn't quite make the grade to the top three. But I'm sure we'll discuss him at length at some point down the line. But yeah, the other thing with Simon Phillips I like is he kind of he got into being a sound engineer as a recording engineer and a producer. So you hear a lot of that in not only his playing but his sound. He's got wide open ringy drums, and won't set up on carpet, has to be on wood floor to get the response, which I like that sound of. And it someone said to me about, or I read in an interview, I can't quite remember, that they went to see him at Ronnie Scott's and stood behind his kit, and it sounded terrible on its own when he was tuning it up. It didn't sound like it was going to just overtake everything. And then they went and stood out the front and listened to it when he started playing it, and his touch was just great. That even though they were really, sort of everything was ringing and buzzing all together, it made a really nice sound, sort of like a piano does. If you had a piano and just leave one string in, it sounds terrible.
Mm.
but when everything else is there to give it the resonance, it sounds a lot better. So I kind of it was just a totally different approach to someone like Gad, who's kit's covered in gaffer tape and dampened and made to sound great still, but in a totally different way.
Mm. We could do a whole series on just our favourite Toto lineups and depths and
Yeah, probably.
yeah, so we'll move on to my next one, which again, I mean, this guy's like, I think in 2020 he was voted or certainly put number one in as the greatest bass player of all time in a top 50 list, which kind of says all you need to know, really. So my second one was James Jamerson, of course, famous for all the Motown records he played on. He was the first bass player that I ever heard of or knew anything about. Learning stuff like My Girl and Stand By Me and those things where the bass is so key. Like with so many of his the stuff that he played on, similar to Jacko in that he passed away really young, which is maybe possibly one of the reasons why those two are still talked about and sort of held in such a high regard. And as we were saying before starting recording, just the list of people that James Jamerson influenced, bass players he influenced, would just be enough to put in a great bass players list in itself. Yeah. I think to influence for people at the time, the Beatles and Paul McCartney really loved him and wanted to play like him. That just kind of says, and this was a guy who was just a sideman, and as we all know, for years they weren't really heard of to the mainstream audience. All the Funk Brothers and the Motown guys weren't talked about in the mainstream, but yeah, really just influenced so many people. He influenced Jacko as well, and yeah, he was just the king of groove, unique in his bass lines, similar to Jacko as well in totally changing the way the bass was kind of thought of, and he a lot of melodic sort of runs and riffs and hooks that would keep going through the song, stuff like Get Ready, and
yeah,
Build Me Up Buttercup, not Build Me Up Buttercup, Sugar Pie Honey Bunch, whatever that one's called.
Yeah, I suppose before that all came about, it would have been either walking bass lines in jazz or two in the bar plodding along, maybe something a bit bluesy. But yeah, I suppose he was one of the first who sort of made having a bass line a thing,
Yeah,
the bass line being recognisable. My Girl's kind of the perfect example, as that kind of carries the tune.
Yeah, I mean, in the stuff like Stand By Me and My Girl, it's when you think of those songs, those bass riffs are what you come to your mind straight away when you say My Girl or Stand By Me, and then you go to something and they're not particularly busy, but they're totally great how he thought of that. And then there's stuff like Ain't No Mountain High Enough, and if it was anybody else, or you'd possibly think that's such a busy bass, he doesn't need to be that busy, but it was just the way he could create these runs and stuff, and still it just sat in the groove, and those tracks wouldn't be the same without it, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Stand By Me thing, the bass riff is the riff.
Yeah,
that's the riff of that song. It isn't on a guitar or anything, it's on the bass.
Yeah,
and same sort of with My Girl. That's, as you say, it's the bit you think of. That whole intro is just the bass, really.
Yeah,
bringing the tune together. So yeah, it was just a complete, as you say, totally different way of thinking about playing a groove.
Yeah, I think one of the differences as well with James Jamerson and someone like Carol Kay or the Wrecking Crew people, which were obviously of the same era, is I think with more of the Wrecking Crew stuff, with certainly with when it came to the Beach Boys stuff, they had their parts written out, and something like the bass line to Good Vibrations, I think Brian Wilson knew what he wanted in that. Whereas with James Jamerson, I think a lot of the time it was just the chords or like just a little. He wouldn't have a much to go on, and he would just go and take it to the next level.
Yeah, I think you're probably right in that. The Funk Brothers they made the groove themselves. They wrote the grooves a lot of the time, whereas the Wrecking Crew were more sort of a give them a chart and they'll play it.
Yeah,
sort of
the hit makers.
Yeah, because it's different parts of the thing. Is in where the Wrecking Crew were in like LA, were probably time is money, got to get it done in minimal amount of time. Whereas the Funk Brothers were more of a not putting too much more time in, but spending the time to make it feel and sound great with what they had, which wasn't Phil Spector producing and making a wall of sound with loads of percussion and overdubs and a choir and all of it. It was just a band and a singer a lot of the time.
Yeah, and one of the like sad things about like James Jamerson is obvious, and with all those kind of session, it's true of a lot of those session guys, is that obviously he wasn't heard of, never really got the recognition he deserved in his lifetime, and eventually sort of fell out of favour. I know he did some like Gladys Knight stuff, and did a few things like in the early 70s, but then with sort of the change of the gear that was being used and the high-tech amps and stuff like slapping coming in, and and people like Jacko coming in as well, who were influenced, and Pino Palladino, who were literally like influenced by James Jamerson, he eventually fell out of favour and wasn't getting the work as much. But yeah, always as we say, always one of the ones who's near the top, and just for the way he influenced so many other people, you can't not talk about him. So
yeah, for sure. And speaking of people you can't not talk about on terms of influence, which might not seem like the most obvious choice, but I will totally back myself up on this, is Ringo Starr.
Yeah.
And a lot of people would say one trick pony, only worked with the Beatles, didn't really do much else. Which, yes, kind of, but also he just talk about changing the game. He changed the game, as far as the Beatles were concerned. Came in late compared to everyone else, although they all knew him, and I think they all idolised him a little bit at the time for his work with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. But he just had a different approach, and again, sort of like Gadd, it was all about the song. Didn't matter how simple or how complicated, it was about the song. Just to pick out a couple, things like In My Life, or on the Please Please Me album even, Anna, Go to Him, the Arthur Alexander thing, he played that just bass, snare and hi-hat pretty much all the way through the verses. Totally spaced out, almost an earlier version of what would be considered now a linear groove, of not playing two things at the same time. So, but just a really different approach. But then you hear things like Ticket to Ride, and that sort of lazy snare and tom groove that he put in was just really clever, and no one would, no one else was doing that. That was just a Ringo thing of, and then following Paul McCartney's bass lines on things like Come Together, just playing, rather than playing a beat, just playing the riff and joining in a little bit with that. And yeah, just his way of playing and his feel more than anything. That sort of slightly straight, slightly swung, sort of really cool feel that so many Beatles songs had. But then it wasn't just, itsy bitsy pop songs. You could argue that the Beatles were one of the first to do sort of a heavy rock track when they did Helter Skelter. And he was lashing the drums and shouting, "I've got blisters on my fingers," and all that bit. And then also doing, light stuff with brushes, like that. This Boy was a brush thing on the hi-hat, and just playing it really simple and laid back was great. But then, his approach as a left-handed player on a right-handed kit comes in when you hear the fills on A Day in the Life, and they're just, it was like only he could have gone, yeah, I'm just going to put loads of fills round this and frame the vocals in, which is what it was. It was all, he wouldn't ever try and tread on a vocal line. If there was a gap, then he'd put his fill in, which I it's totally the right way to play. But I think the amount of inspiration he had on every player that followed, and certainly for me, I think he was one of the first drummers, like that I really took notice of and went, oh, he's great. I like him, and obviously heard all the Beatles stuff, watched all the documentaries and the live footage that that I could get my hands on, and just became absorbed in that, and went and saw him with the All Star Band about 15 years ago now in Liverpool, and that was an amazing gig. And seeing him double drumming with Greg Bissonette, who himself was really influenced by Ringo, was really nice. And then just his way of doing that, and then of course joining Paul McCartney on the gig I saw him do a couple of years ago at the O2, which I shall never stop rubbing into you because I know you wish you were there. But yeah, it's like he's just total, a real one-off. That he wasn't a real technique master, or he didn't work with the great and the good of the jazz world or the great and the good of anything else aside from his sort of his Beatles thing and then his solo stuff and his all-star band stuff later on, where you've had people like Steve Lukather come in, or different players. Edgar Winter's done the all-star band at different times. Richard Page from Mr. Mister. So he's still had some different names in his lineup, which makes for a good band. I just wish they came over here more often and toured around, because they haven't done for years.
Yeah, I think as well, like when you watch something like I did recently, the whole Get Back film, I think when you see how they were kind of working and out when it wasn't always cooking and they were having a tough time, like when they would eventually come to play, and for that documentary film they're playing a lot of the same songs over and over again. Ringo's like the steady, holding it together, and then when they eventually get to the rooftop concert, he's just like great. That's one of the things that when people say about him not being a great drummer, I'd say, well, watch the rooftop concert. And like what you were saying about the kind of lazy, not if it's swung or if it's straight, like the Long and Winding Road's one of the sort of like great examples of that, where you're not quite sure if it's swung or if it's straight at times.
Yeah, it's just total. Yeah, it's just playing the right thing for the music, which is exactly what that gig, as in the Beatles, that's what he had to do, because that's what it was all about. You had two of, let's argue, the greatest songwriters of all time in your band. You've got to make their songs sound good. And
yeah.
Same goes for them all as musicians, but Ringo in particular just, he came in and did his thing.
Yeah, one of the things with you saying about the All-Star Band, it's one of those YouTube recommended things. I kept getting things for his All-Star Band, and I've seen bits of it, but never really paid that much attention to it. And then I just happened to just click on one of their last concert DVDs of the Greek theatre, I think, and of the video of him doing "Don't Pass Me By," which of course is one of his songs that he wrote in the Beatles. And it's like one of those really basic, kind of songs, couple of chords, but just like his ability to write a really catchy little, country rock tune as well. Just, I love it. And what a great band he has. Like the best ever version you're going to hear of that song with Steve Lukather and, and Greg Bissonette and all that on it. It's great.
Yeah. So let's throw it to you for your last pick.
Yeah, so my last pick is one that's not obvious for like one of these list things, but it is. I think I have talked about him before when we did the top our favourite sort of bass and drum duos, and it's John Patitucci, obviously known for his work with Chick Corea in the electric band and his acoustic band. He's probably my favourite bass player, and just kind of purely because around probably nearly 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, I'd say, I thought I kind of knew about bass and knew bass players and was pretty comfortable with my taste in like who I liked and everything. And then, as you do, we were watching some music stuff on the TV, and my dad said, "Oh, put in Gotta Match Chick Corea," and I'd never heard of Chick Corea, or I mean, I'd heard the name, I think, but I kind of just thought of it as like, oh, it's like gonna be really like weird jazz and stuff, not like my kind of thing at all. And yeah, put that video on, and like not even before he got to his solo, my jaw was on the floor. And I just remember messaging a friend who, was massive on Dave Weckl, and obviously it was Dave Weckl on drums. And I said to him, "You need to check this video out." And we were messaging each other while the video was still going on, saying, "Oh my god!" Yeah, just awesome bass player. Sort of around the same time, along with like Anthony Jackson, brought the 6-string bass into the spotlight. And just has also obviously had a career playing with some of the best musicians in the world, in his own like sort of trios and bands, and in others, like guys like Vinnie Colaiuta, Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock, and obviously the Chick Corea trios, which, as I said before on that episode, it's, I think, the best amalgamation of players of all time. Just like the three, in my opinion, best guys at what they do. I mean, the thing with like these lists and, the greatest of all time, it's like, there's a million other bass players and drummers and guys that you'll never have heard of that are probably, in wherever in the Philippines or in wherever, that are probably like amazing as well. But out of the ones we've heard of, he's certainly up there for me. And I think at the moment he's an artist in residence at Berkeley, obviously in the States. And on top of those guys that I mentioned before, he's worked with, I think he started out his career sort of working with Dave Grusin, and then he's worked with people like Omar Hakim, Lee Ritner, Pete Erskine, who we mentioned before, Arturo Sandoval, and just so many more. Too many to mention.
That's it. I suppose he's best known for the stuff with Chick, which is where I've definitely heard most of sort of him knowingly. There's probably stuff I've heard with him on it that I've never realised was with him, as there are with all these players. You listen to something and, I think it's always interesting when a player has that stamp that you can listen to something and go, oh, I'm sure it's going to be, even without knowing the band or not knowing who the artist was, and you go, that sounds like either them or someone trying to do it their way. You know what I mean? I've definitely had that with Steve Gadd before, where I've heard a record and thought, that sounds very Gadd. That must be. And it was. Totally was. And I was like, yeah, I'm not surprised, but I want to hear that song again now, or I want to hear that piece of music again to pick it apart, a bit. But yeah, Patitucci, I mean, an amazing player, and of course someone, I was just thinking there that all three of mine I've managed to see live at some point, and obviously for you can't say the same, but I think you have seen Patitucci live, have you not?
Yeah, and like one of those, very fortunate to obviously have got to see him with Chick Corea now that he's passed away, that was with the acoustic band, and so obviously he was on upright bass, and it was just unbelievable. I think they only probably played less than 5 tunes because each one's like really long, but just, as I've mentioned before on the podcast, one of my like favourite things I've ever been to see, and got to meet him afterwards, as like we know at Ronnie Scott's you can do, like when they just come out for a drink or whatever, and he was really nice guy. And one of the reasons I've put him in it obviously is because he's like my hero, but it's like he's not an obvious one in that he's not as talked about as of that era, people kind of go more towards Anthony Jackson, who of course is a monster as well, and would, he's one of those honourable mentions, because I know a lot of bass players have him near the top of the list. But he's not as talked about as Anthony Jackson, I think, because he's not done many all sort of mainstream things, whereas Anthony Jackson obviously worked with people like Paul Simon, and but he's one of the reasons as well. I mean, I hold him up with like someone like Lawrence Cottle, in that he's like, you watch him doing the Chick Corea thing and like all those fast runs and just tearing up the 6-string bass and just such unique and amazing solos. And then you watch other things and he's like doing an amazing slap thing, and that's like not a technique you associate with him. Similar to Lawrence Cottle, it's like you don't see him doing it that much, and then all of a sudden they're amazing at that as well. And like with Patitucci, it's he just got such big shoes to fill. When, like, I know there's a video, I'm not sure if it's still on YouTube, but I saw a few years ago of Nathan East playing with the Electric Band, and I think he was like just covering for a little while on one of the tours, and you can see, and he's like said afterwards he really struggled with that gig. It was like kind of, that was the top of his like ability there, and they did got a match on that gig, and he like couldn't play the run like fast enough, which just sort of says how great Patitucci is, and just awesome player.
Yeah, so on that subject, a little bit of honourable mentions. So why don't you give us a couple of those, and I'll do a few as well.
Yeah, well, obviously, like people like Paul McCartney could have been on there, just like for the reasons that you gave with Ringo, really influential and unique. Bernard Edwards would have been near there for just my personal pick, just because of the influence on me, and obviously on bass player since. Anthony Jackson, as I mentioned before, Stanley Clarke. Somebody who just a little thing with Stanley Clarke that I heard about was, and I think it might even be mentioned in the Get Back or one film or one of these things, is that Paul, or maybe it was later on, McCartney wanted to get a lesson with Stanley Clarke, met Stanley Clarke, and wanted to sort of get his advice on bass playing and stuff, and how he does the stuff that he could do. And Stanley Clarke like said to him, like, why do you want to play like me, man? Like, everybody's trying to learn come together, and everybody's trying to learn like something. And he said, like, you're fine for what you do, man. So Marcus Miller would have been another one who at the top of that list, for, again, more of a personal one, but also an awesome player. Victor Wooten. They're a couple of my sort of honourable mentions. A handful. Yeah. What about you?
Obviously Jeff Porcaro, as we mentioned before. Bernard Purdie would have definitely been up there. But then sort of, some of the non sort of commercial players. You get people like Elvin Jones, Tony Williams, Louis Belson. Really love Louis Belson's playing. Just again different at the time. Kenny Clare, of one of the British session guys who, I've had long conversations with Neil Wilkinson about Kenny Clare. Once you get Neil started on Kenny, that's it. It's but no, what a player Kenny Clare was, doing early Tom Jones things and some really cool gigs and some great big band work as well. But then you get people like Brian Bennett. Great, really great player with the Shadows stuff, but also, later on doing his film work as, just there's a handful. I could go a lot deeper. Dave Garibaldi from Tower of Power is another one, and there's probably a whole host more that I've missed that I could have quite easily, gone into total detail on. I mean, I'm a terrible hoarder for old drum magazines and things, and try and just build up your knowledge and your base of people you like, people you're interested in, but also I quite enjoy reading about people I've never heard of, who did, whether they were in a band or whether they were a session guy around for a little bit in the 60s or Hal Blaine. There's another one I could have definitely talked about for a little bit. What is there to say about Hal Blaine other than I think he's still probably the most recorded drummer in history. I want to say I could be wrong there, but I think it's probably close. J.R. Robinson is another sort of studio legend who, just dissecting some of their playing is like you can get so much out of it to work on yourself or to listen out for. But yeah, I think that covers a small smattering of of honourable mentions for me.
Yeah. So of course, with the end of this episode, that brings the end to our second season of Groovecast.
That's it. Yeah, 20 episodes total.
Yeah.
So if you missed any, you can go back and listen to them all.
Yeah. And yeah, it's been a good season. Obviously, we've had some memorable episodes. Obviously, if you haven't, any of the ones you've missed out, go back and check them out. And we should have some exciting new stuff coming later in the year, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Some more episodes on the way. Fingers crossed. And also we've got, which will probably have been out for a few weeks by the time this episode goes out, but we've got some exciting new branding and had some great work done by a great musician and arranger, but also great artist Simon Whiteside, who's done some lovely stuff for Groovecast. So if you haven't already, go and check his page out. I'm sure we'll tag it in when we upload some of the new images he's created for us, because they're pretty cool.
Yeah, so thanks once again for watching and listening if you're listening to this on any of the other platforms. And until next time, we'll see you on Groovecast.
See you next season.